In northern Dakota Territory, the wind does not gust. It runs. It crosses the open prairie from the northwest in a single, unbroken push that bends the grass flat and keeps it flat, that pulls smoke sideways from chimneys and holds it there, that finds every crack in every wall and whistles through with the patience of something that has nowhere else to be. On a quarter section 6 miles from the nearest timber, a man crouched in a trench he had dug by hand, pressing a seedling into the dirt. His fingers were split and dark with soil. Behind him, a cabin no bigger than a freight wagon. Behind that, a single post on a low rise, marking the only other thing he had planted here. Warren T. Voss had never stood on ground this flat. He came from Bath, Maine, where the coast broke itself against granite, and the wind always had something to argue with: a hill, a stand of white pine, a ship hull canted on the ways. He knew wind the way a sailmaker's son knows it, which is to say he knew it as a force with habits. It could be read, it could be split, it could be made to go around things. But that was in Maine, where the world gave wind something to do. Here in northern Dakota Territory, in the last week of October 1879, the wind had nothing to do but run. It crossed the open quarter from the northwest without a single object between the horizon and Warren's face, and it did not slow down. He had arrived 4 days earlier on a freight wagon out of Fargo with his wife, Eliza, their daughter Ruth, who was 9, their son Abel, who was 5, one draft mare named Birch, a trunk of tools, and $39 in mixed coin. The homestead claim was a half-paid quarter section 6 miles from the nearest reliable timber along the Cheyenne River bottoms. A man named Pollard had filed on it the year before, planted nothing, built nothing, and sold the improvement rights for $11 and a saddle. Warren had the saddle. He did not have $11 to spare, but he paid it because the claim included a started cabin, 12 feet by 16, with cottonwood walls chinked badly with river mud and a roof of split poles covered in sod that had already begun to sag on the northwest corner. Eliza stood in the doorway of that cabin on their first evening and pressed her palm against the wall. The mud chinking had cracked where it dried too fast, and wind came through in thin, whistling lines. She could feel it on her wrist. She told Warren the cabin breathed, and she did not mean it as a compliment. He spent the first week recalking. He mixed mud with prairie grass and pressed it into every seam he could reach, working with his fingers because the trowel he had brought from Maine was sized for boat caulk and too narrow for the gaps. The children gathered buffalo chips and dried cow dung for fuel, while Eliza set the cracked cook stove, a number 4 box stove with a split firebox plate that leaked smoke when the draft pulled wrong. Warren stuffed the crack with a folded strip of tin cut from a peach can. It held, but barely. When the wind backed northwest and gusted, the stove coughed gray smoke into the cabin, and the children coughed with it. He had 2.5 cords of cottonwood and willow stacked against the south wall, cut by Pollard and left to season. It was not enough. Warren knew it was not enough because he had asked the freight driver on the way in, and the driver had said 6 cords minimum for a family in a tight cabin, and that was if the cabin was tight, which this one was not. $39. A stove with a cracked plate. 2.5 cords. A cabin the wind could whistle through. And winter had already sent its first messenger. A skin of ice on the rain barrel every morning, melting by noon, thickening by the day. Then Eliza got sick. It started as a cough in November, dry and persistent, the kind that wakes a cabin at 3 in the morning. By December it was wet. By January it had settled into her chest like something that had moved in and intended to stay. Warren boiled willow bark. He hung blankets across the cabin to trap heat near her pallet. He burned through a full cord in 3 weeks, trying to keep the temperature high enough that her breathing would ease, and it did not ease. The nearest doctor was in a river town 22 miles southeast, and the roads were blown shut. Eliza Voss died on the 14th of February, 1880, in a cabin that was not warm enough, on a homestead she had lived on for less than 4 months. She was 29 years old. Warren wrapped her in the quilt her mother had sent from Portland and carried her outside because the children should not watch what came next. He dug the grave himself. The ground was frozen to a depth of 14 inches, and it took him 2 days with a mattock and a fire pit to soften enough earth. He set the grave 30 feet south of the cabin, on a slight rise where the snow would not drift, and he marked it with a cottonwood post because he had no stone. Ruth stood at the grave and held Abel's hand and did not cry. She was 9 years old and had already learned that crying used energy the body could not spare. Warren had $21 left. He had 1¼ cords of fuel. He had a mare that needed feed he could not buy. He had 2 children who needed a mother he could not replace. And he had a cabin that shuddered every time the northwest wind crossed the open quarter, which was nearly every day. He could not leave. Leaving meant abandoning the claim, losing the $11 and the improvement work, arriving penniless in Fargo with 2 children and no prospects. His nearest relatives were in Maine, and passage east for 3 cost more than he had. Eliza was buried here. The ground held her. Warren would not walk away from the ground that held her. That spring, Ephraim Bowyer rode in on a gray gelding and did not dismount for the first 4 minutes. He sat in the saddle and looked at the cabin, the woodpile, the sagging roof, the grave marker, the children sitting on an overturned crate shelling the last of the seed corn, and he made his assessment before his boots touched dirt. Bowyer was 61 years old, a county tree claim inspector and former timber cruiser who had spent 20 years in the Wisconsin pineries before the trees ran out, and the government sent him west to make sure settlers planted new ones. He had a face like a clenched fist, and a voice that carried the authority of a man who had seen 500 homesteads fail and did not expect the next one to surprise him. He walked the cabin first. He pressed his thumb into the chinking at the northwest corner, and it crumbled. He checked the roof poles and said nothing. He counted the remaining fuel, just under 1.5 cords of mixed cottonwood and willow, most of it unseasoned and punky. He looked at the stove, saw the tin patch on the firebox plate, and looked at Warren. "You do not have a house," Bowyer said. "You have a box the wind has not opened yet." Warren said nothing. Bowyer walked the quarter section. He checked the soil, which was rich black loam under the prairie sod, good wheat ground, the kind that had drawn 10,000 settlers into the territory in the last 2 years. He noted the absence of any windbreak, any tree line, any rise or depression that might shelter the homestead from the northwest. The nearest trees were cottonwood and willow along a slough 1/2 mile south, and those were scrub. "A family in a cabin this loose needs 6 cords before January," Bowyer said. "You have 1.5 cords of wood that will burn fast and dirty. You owe money at the store. You have no crop in. Your wife is dead. Your children are thin." He paused, and Warren could see the man was not being cruel. He was counting. "I have inspected 300 claims in this territory. The ones that fail look like this." "I filed a tree claim," Warren said. Bowyer looked at him. "The Timber Culture Act allowed a settler to claim an additional quarter section by planting trees, 40 acres of them, with specific survival requirements over 13 years. It was, on paper, a way to get free land. In practice, it was a way to break a man's back. The trees died. The rain did not come. The wind stripped seedlings out of the ground before they could root. Bowyer had inspected dozens of tree claims, and the failure rate was staggering. "Trees on open prairie die," Bowyer said. "Rain cannot be trusted past the James River. Weeds will take any seedling you plant before its second summer. and a man with 2 children and no wife cannot wait 10 years for shade. He looked at the grave marker. I am sorry about your wife. I am telling you what I have seen. I know wind, Warren said. Everyone on this prairie knows wind, Bowyer replied. It does not help them. Warren owed $18 at Mercer Blaine's store in town. He needed a new stoveplate, which cost $6. He needed 3.5 more cords of fuel, which meant either buying it at $4 a cord from the river bottom cutters, or spending weeks hauling it himself from the Cheyenne Bottom 6 miles away with one mare and no proper wagon. He had 26 days before the fall freight road became unreliable, which meant 26 days to get materials, food, and fuel positioned for winter. The math was not difficult. The math was impossible. Bowyer mounted his gray gelding and looked down at Warren from the saddle. You have a season, he said. Use it to sell what you can and take those children somewhere with a roof that holds. Warren watched him ride east until the gray horse was a smudge against the grass. Then he turned and looked at the open quarter to the northwest, where the wind came from, and he thought about sails. The realization did not come as a single moment. It came in pieces across the spring and early summer of 1880, the way a man assembles a thought when he is too busy surviving to sit down and think. The first piece came during a May storm. Warren had taken Ruth and Abel to the slough to cut willow switches for basket weaving, a skill Eliza had taught Ruth, and one of the few things they could sell in town. The wind blew hard from the northwest, driving rain sideways across the open ground, but at the slough, where a broken wagon board leaned against a cottonwood stump at an angle to the wind, Warren noticed something. The rain behind the board fell differently. It was not dry behind the board. The rain still reached the ground, but the force was different. The drops fell instead of driving. The board did not stop the storm. It changed where the storm spent its energy. He stood in the rain and watched it for a long time, long enough that Ruth asked whether he was sick. The second piece came a week later. Ruth hung Eliza's wool shawl on 2 pegs near the stove to dry. The cabin door was open to the spring air, and a cross draft moved through the room. Before the shawl went up, the stove flame guttered and the smoke drifted sideways. After the shawl went up, the flame steadied. The wool did not stop the air. It slowed it, broke its direction, bled off its force. Warren sat on the cabin floor and stared at the shawl, and remembered his father's sail loft in Bath. Samuel Voss had been a sailmaker for 30 years, and he had a way of teaching that involved holding things near flames and watching what happened. He would take a strip of canvas and hold it at an angle to a candle and show young Warren how the flame bent, how the air divided around the cloth, how some of it spilled over the top and some curled underneath, and some, the part that mattered, lost its speed. A sail did not fight the wind, his father said. A sail negotiated with it. That night, after the children were asleep, Warren took a piece of stove charcoal and drew on the cabin wall. He did not draw a square grove. He did not draw a straight line of trees, which was what every other tree claim settler planted, because the law said 40 acres, and the easiest way to plant 40 acres was in rows. He drew a wedge. The sharp point faced northwest, directly into the prevailing winter wind. The 2 arms of the wedge spread apart as they extended southeast, widening until they opened behind the cabin with roughly 70 feet of space between them. The cabin sat in the protected pocket at the wide end, the way a man stands behind a ship's bow and lets the hull break the sea. The logic was his father's logic. A flat wall fights the wind and eventually loses. A wedge splits it. The wind hits the point and divides, half streaming down the north arm, half down the west arm, and by the time it reaches the open pocket behind the wedge, it has lost its force. It does not stop. It slows. The cabin does not need to be windproof. It needs to be in a place where the wind arrives tired. Warren planned the specifics on the wall. The wedge point would begin 280 feet northwest of the cabin. Each arm would run roughly 360 feet. The windward rows would be eastern red cedar and whatever hardy spruce he could get, dense, evergreen, with branches and needles that held through winter when bare deciduous wood was useless against the cold. The inner nurse rows would be box elder and willow, fast growers that would hold moisture and protect the slower evergreens from summer drought. The rows would be staggered, 12 feet apart, seedling 6 feet apart within each row, to create a dense living wall that the wind could not punch through in a straight line. If it worked, and it would take years to know, the cabin would sit 4 to 5 tree heights behind the densest row. That was the distance Warren's instinct said mattered, the distance where a sail's wind shadow was strongest, close enough to benefit, far enough to avoid the turbulence that curled over the top of any barrier. The risk was enormous. The design stole nearly 2 acres from wheat ground. It required water, mulching, replacement seedlings, and time. Years of time that Warren did not have. If the trees died, he lost crop acreage and gained nothing but ridicule. If they lived but were too thin, the wind would pour through the gaps like water through a broken dam. And even if the wedge worked perfectly at maturity, the trees could not help him this winter, or the next, or the one after that. He stared at the charcoal drawing on the wall. It looked like the prow of a ship. He could hear his father saying that a ship does not argue with the ocean. It goes through. Jonas Rudd came by 3 days later. Jonas was 37, a Canadian from Ontario who had filed the adjacent quarter section and planted 60 acres of wheat in his first year. He was practical in the way that successful farmers are practical. He did what worked, repeated what worked, and distrusted anything that had not already worked somewhere he could see. He was not unfriendly. He simply could not understand why a man with no crop, no wife, and 2 children would spend his time digging trenches for tree seedlings. He stood in the cabin and looked at the charcoal drawing. "You came here for land, Warren. Now you are planting a wall across it." "Not a wall," Warren said. "A wedge." "A wedge." Jonas traced the lines with his finger. "How many acres does this steal from wheat?" "Close to 2. 2 acres of the best black loam in the territory, and you are going to fill it with pine trees. Cedar, spruce, box elder for the inner rows." Jonas turned from the wall. "Trees take years. Winter comes every year. You cannot eat a seedling, Warren. You cannot burn a sapling that is not grown. What are you going to do this December while your wedge is 6 inches tall?" It was the right question, and Warren did not have a good answer. He said he would haul fuel from the river bottoms and trade labor for cordwood and patch the cabin tighter and burn less. Jonas shook his head. He had seen men burn less. They froze. "I am not saying it is stupid," Jonas said, and he meant it. "I am saying it is backwards. Fix the cabin, break more ground, plant wheat and sell it, and buy proper fuel and a proper stove. Then, in 5 years, if you have money and time, plant your trees." "In 5 years, I will have burned through 25 cords of wood hauled 6 miles on bad roads," Warren said. "Every cord costs time I cannot spend on anything else. The wind does not wait 5 years." Jonas left unconvinced, and Warren could not blame him. The plan sounded like a man who was planting hope in the ground because he had nothing else to plant, and maybe it was. But Warren had stood in the sail loft with his father and watched the canvas change the air, and he had stood in the rain behind a broken wagon board and watched the drops fall instead of drive. And he knew, not believed, knew that the wind could be negotiated with. The question was whether seedlings could grow fast enough to hold up their end of the bargain. Mercer T. Blaine had a way of smiling that made the person across the counter feel like they had already lost the negotiation. He was 45, built wide, with a store that served as the town's general supply, credit office, and gossip exchange. He sold flour, nails, seed, harness leather, stove parts, and patience, the last at the highest markup. Settlers who could not pay cash bought on credit, and Blaine held the notes with the relaxed grip of a man who knew that time was on his side. When a homesteader failed, Blaine bought the improvement rights for less than the debt, resold the claim, and stocked the profit. He was not evil, he was efficient, and he had seen Warren's account. Warren came to the store in June with a list. Stoveplate, $6. 50 pounds of flour, $2.10. Nails, $1.40. Salt, soap, lamp oil. He also asked about seedlings, specifically whether Blaine could order eastern red cedar bundles from the nursery downriver. Blaine set the stoveplate on the counter. Your account stands at $18, Voss. You want to add to it. I can work off part of it. I will split rails. I have rail splitters. What I do not have is a reason to extend more credit to a man who plants trees instead of wheat. The store had 4 other men in it. Warren could feel them listening. Blaine knew they were listening. This was how reputation was built on the prairie out. In the general store, in front of witnesses, with the storekeeper holding the scales. You have heard about the Wedge, Warren said. I have heard you are farming shade. Blaine weighed a spare harness buckle Warren had brought to trade. What I want to know is what your children eat while you wait for your shade to grow. Warren asked whether the cedar seedlings were bundled wet. Blaine looked at him. Then he laughed, and the room laughed with him, because Blaine had asked the important question and Warren had answered with the species of tree. It was the laugh of men who thought they were watching a fool, and it would have stung more if Warren had not already heard it from Jonas, from Bowyer, from the freight driver who had brought his last supply run. 200 cedar seedlings, Blaine said. I will order them. I will add them to your note. And when you cannot pay, I will take the mare. He said it plainly, the way a man states a fact. Warren heard it as a threat, which it was, and as a deadline, which it also was. He took the stoveplate, the flour, and the seedlings when they arrived 3 weeks later. He left the buckle. He walked the 6 miles home carrying 80 pounds on his back because birch was needed to haul water to the planting trenches. The phrase traveled. Voss's useless forest started at the store counter and moved outward like a stone dropped in a stock pond. By midsummer, men who had never seen the claim were repeating it. Jonas heard it at the grain elevator and said nothing, which was better than repeating it and worse than defending it. Bowyer heard it during his inspection rounds and wrote in his notes that the Voss tree claim was ambitious but likely to fail before 3rd year. The community had rendered its verdict. Warren was a sailmaker's son who did not understand wheat, did not understand prairie, and was wasting good ground on trees that would die before his children were old enough to remember them. Ruth heard Blaine's phrase secondhand. A boy at the settlement school told her that her father was burying the family in shade. She came home and repeated it at the supper table without emotion, the way she reported weather or the price of eggs. Warren looked at his daughter, thin, careful, carrying duties no 9-year-old should carry, and said the trees would not make shade for a long time. They would make something better. Ruth asked what. Warren said quiet. She did not understand, but she would. He started planting in the first week of July, which was late but unavoidable. The ground needed to be broken first, and breaking sod with 1 mare and a walking plow on ground that had never been turned was work measured in yards per hour, not acres per day. Warren marked the wedge point 280 feet northwest of the cabin with a cottonwood stake and a strip of flour sack. He sighted the arms using the chimney smoke. On calm mornings, the smoke rose straight, but every afternoon, when the northwest breeze picked up, it bent southeast, and the angle of the bend told him where the wind would drive hardest in winter. He dug the first trench by hand. The plow could break the sod, but the seedling trenches needed depth, 8 inches for the cedar roots, angled so water would drain toward the plant, not pool and freeze. He worked in the early morning and the late evening, avoiding the midday heat that wilted the cedar bundles he kept wrapped in wet burlap under the wagon. Ruth carried water from the slough in 2 pails suspended from a harness yoke Warren had built from willow branches. Abel, 5 years old and fierce about helping, dragged brush to the planting rows for mulch. The first row went in along the north arm of the wedge, 47 cedar seedlings, each no taller than Warren's forearm, set 6 feet apart in trenches 12 feet from the next row. He packed the roots by hand, pressing the soil firm with his fist, then mounding a shallow basin around each seedling to catch rain. The work took 3 days for 1 row. He had 16 rows planned across both arms, his hands blistered by the second week. The blisters broke and bled, and he wrapped them in strips of Eliza's old cotton shift because bandage cloth cost money. His back seized on the 4th morning, and he worked stooped for 2 days until it released. He lost weight he could not afford to lose. Ruth started leaving his plate on the stove when he came in after dark, and he ate standing because sitting down meant not standing up again. By August, he had planted 6 rows, 3 on each arm, totaling 260 seedlings. The cedar bundles from Blaine's order were in the ground. The willow cuttings he had taken from the slough were planted along the inner nurse rows, where they would grow fast and hold moisture for the slower evergreens. He had 40 box elder seedlings from a settler who was pulling out and gave them away rather than haul them east. But the heat was brutal and the rain did not come. By mid-August, 31 seedlings had yellowed. 14 were dead, dry from root to tip, standing in their basins like small brown bones. Warren pulled them and counted the gaps. Each gap was a place where the wind would pour through once the trees grew, if the trees grew. Each gap was a failure he could not afford. He stood at the wedge point on an August evening and looked down both arms. The seedlings were pitiful, tiny, sparse, some leaning, some brown, none taller than his knee. The cabin sat at the far end, smoke beating flat from the chimney. Between the seedlings and the cabin was nothing but open ground, exactly as it had been before he started. Bowyer's words came back. Trees on open prairie die. And then he looked at the ones that had not died. The cedars in the first row, the ones he had planted deepest and watered most, were green, not tall, not thick, not anything that could stop a breeze, let alone a gale, but green, alive. Their roots in the ground and their needles reaching into the air that would one day, if he could keep them alive long enough, become the air they would break. He had 229 living seedlings, a cabin the wind still whistled through, 1 quart of fuel stacked for winter, $18 of debt at the store, and a stove with a cracked plate held together by a strip of peach tin. Winter was 14 weeks away. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who could not understand what you were building? Warren went back to the trenches. He dug until he could not see the stakes in the dark, and then he dug by feel because the seedlings did not care whether he was tired. They only cared whether the ground was ready. And the ground was not ready enough, not yet, not nearly. The woman appeared on foot in the 2nd week of September, walking the slough road from the east with a canvas sack over one shoulder and a spade strapped across her back. Warren saw her from the planting trenches and thought she was lost. Nobody walked the slough road on foot unless they had no horse, and nobody had no horse unless something had gone badly wrong. Her name was Barbro Vangen. She was 58 years old, Norwegian, widowed, and she had buried a husband, 2 draft horses, and a tree claim in the Red River Valley settlement 40 miles northeast. She had walked here because walking was free, and she had heard from a freighter that a man west of the Cheyenne was planting trees in a shape that was not rows, and she wanted to see whether he was a fool or something else. She did not introduce herself with any of that. She walked to the nearest cedar seedling in the first row, knelt beside it, and pulled it gently by the stem. The root ball came up too easily. She pressed the roots between her thumb and 2 fingers, feeling the texture, and looked at Warren. "This one died yesterday," she said. "You have not buried it yet." Warren came down from the trench line. He had expected another critic, another bowyer telling him the trees would fail, another Jonas shaking his head. But Barbro was not looking at the plan. She was looking at the roots. "The soil is good," she said. "The spacing is good. The shape I have not seen before, but the wind reading is correct. I can see from the snow scour where you marked it." She turned the dead seedling over in her hands. "Your roots dried before they went in the ground. You did not puddle them." Warren did not know what puddling meant. Barbro showed him. She dug a shallow hole near the slough edge, mixed the clay-heavy subsoil with water until it became a thick brown slurry the consistency of porridge, and dipped the bare roots of a replacement seedling into it. The clay coated the fine root hairs and sealed them against air. When she planted the seedling, the roots went into the ground wet, coated, and protected. The difference was not visible above the soil line. It was entirely underground, entirely invisible, and entirely the difference between a tree that lived and a tree that died in its first week. "My husband filed a tree claim in '76, Barbro said. "He planted 1,200 cottonwood whips in straight rows and lost 800 the first summer. I told him the roots were drying. He told me he had been planting trees since Norway." She paused. "He was a good man. He was also wrong." Warren asked what happened to the tree claim. "The trees died. Then he died. Then the horses died. I sold the claim to a man from St. Paul who wanted the sod broken and not the trees replanted." She looked at the charcoal drawing through the open cabin door. "That is not a tree claim. What is that?" Warren told her about the sail loft, about the canvas near the flame, about the wagon board in the rain and the shawl on the pegs. Barbro listened without interrupting, which was unusual for a woman who had opinions about everything, and when he finished she walked the wedge line from point to cabin and back again, counting steps, checking the angle of the arms against the chimney smoke. "The idea is not foolish," she said. "It is incomplete." She stayed 3 days. In those 3 days she taught Warren more about keeping seedlings alive than he had learned in 4 months of trial and error. The first teaching was the puddling, boughs, clay slurry on every bare root before planting. Warren went back through the surviving rows and lifted every seedling he could reach without killing it, dipped the roots, and replanted. It cost him a week of labor, and he lost 11 more trees in the process, but the ones he reset stopped yellowing within 10 days. The second teaching was basin planting. Barbro showed him how to scrape shallow saucers around each seedling, 3 inches deep and 18 inches wide, so that snow melt and rain would pool at the roots instead of sheeting away across the prairie surface. Warren had made basins, but they were too small and too shallow. Barbro made hers with the spade edge angled precisely, cutting a lip that held water long enough to soak. "A seedling does not need a river," she said. "It needs a cup that does not spill." The third teaching was weed control. Prairie grass was the seedling's real enemy. Not wind, not drought, but the thick, competitive root mat of native sod that surrounded every planting hole and drank the water before the tree could reach it. Barbaro stripped the grass in a circle 18 inches from every trunk, pulling it by hand where the spade would damage roots, and then laid a ring of slaff hay and manure as mulch. The mulch held moisture, smothered regrowth, and rotted into food for the soil beneath it. "You will do this every spring for 5 years," she said. "If you stop before the trees shade out the grass will win." Warren looked at the 200-odd seedlings stretching down both arms of the wedge and calculated the hours. 18 inches of weeding per tree, twice per growing season, multiplied by however many trees survived. It was brutal arithmetic. Barbaro saw his face and said nothing sympathetic. She had done the same arithmetic on 1,200 cottonwoods and done the work alone after her husband died. She left on the 4th morning with her canvas sack and spade. At the Slough Road, she turned and said, "The shape is right. The species are right. Whether you can keep them alive long enough is not about the trees. It is about you." Warren watched her walk east until she was a dark mark against the grass, and then he went back to the trenches because the trees did not care that he had just met the first person who believed his plan might work. The years compressed the way frontier years do, not gently, but by force. Each season pressed against the next, and the only way to measure progress was to stand at the wedge point and look down the arms and count what had survived. Year 1 ended with 600 trees planted across both arms of the wedge. By the time the ground froze in November, 140 were dead. Some had dried despite the puddling. Some had been pulled by wind before the roots could grip. Some had simply failed for reasons that seedlings fail: wrong depth, wrong soil pocket, wrong angle of sun. Warren marked each dead position with a stick so he could replant in spring. That first full winter nearly killed him. He burned through 4 cords of fuel, 2 hauled from the river bottoms on 7 separate trips that took 2 days each, and 2 bought on credit from Blaine at $4 a cord, adding $8 to a debt that already kept him awake at night. The cabin was no warmer. The wind still found the seams. The stove still coughed when the draft turned. Ruth developed a cough in January that lasted 6 weeks and sounded enough like Eliza's that Warren did not sleep until it broke. But spring came, and the surviving trees were still standing. Year 2. Barbaro returned in April with a bundle of willow cutting she had taken from a Red River grove. She stayed a week. Together they replaced the dead positions and added a second staggered line to the windward rows, alternating cedar and spruce where the exposure was worst. Barbaro taught Warren to read the trees the way he read wind, by the direction of lean, the density of needle growth, the color of new tips. A tree leaning southeast had been pushed. A tree with thin needles on the north face was starving for light. A tree with brown tips in June was drowning. The willow cuttings along the inner arms rooted fast, which was the point. Willows grew in 3 years what cedar grew in 7. They would hold soil, trap moisture, and shelter the slower evergreens from summer heat until the cedars could fend for themselves. By August of year 2, the willows were already waist high, the first visible sign that the wedge was not just a drawing on a wall. Year 3 brought the first real setback. Grasshoppers came through in late July, not the apocalyptic clouds that had stripped entire counties in the 70s, but enough to chew the box elder leaves down to vein and stem. The cedars were untouched because hoppers do not eat evergreen needles, but the box elders looked skeletal and the willows lost half their canopy in 2 days. Warren spent an evening standing in the rows watching insects chew his work, and there was nothing he could do about it except wait for them to move on and hope the roots held. They held. The box elders leafed out again in September, thin and late but alive. Also, in year 3, Warren built a temporary brush fence at the wedge point, a wall of cut willow and cottonwood branches woven between stakes, 6 feet tall and 15 feet wide, positioned to take the worst of the northwest wind off the young evergreens behind it. The brush fence was ugly and required rebuilding after every hard blow, but it bought the cedars one more winter of reduced exposure. It was the kind of solution that looked like failure, sticks and rope holding back the weather, but it worked the way temporary things work by buying time for permanent things to grow. Year 4. Abel broke his arm hauling water from the slough. He was 8 years old and determined to carry 2 full pails on the willow yoke, and he tripped on a root he could not see under the mulch. The left arm snapped clean above the wrist. Warren set it with 2 splints and strips of canvas, sailmaker's work, the kind of binding his father had used on cracked boom poles, and rode Birch to the doctor in town, 14 miles because the nearer doctor had moved to Bismarck. The ride cost a day. The doctor cost $3. The $3 came from the seed money Warren had saved for spring wheat, which meant no wheat crop in year 4, which meant no income, which meant more debt at Blaine's store. Blaine called in $7 of the note during seed buying week, knowing exactly what the timing meant. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply presented the paper and said the balance was overdue and asked when Warren intended to settle it. Warren sold his spare plow blade, the one he had brought from Maine for deep-breaking work he had never done, and paid 5 of the 7. Blaine accepted it and wrote the remaining $2 back onto the note at interest. "Your forest is growing," Blaine said. "Your debt is growing faster." Warren walked home in the dark, carrying nothing because he had sold the last thing worth carrying. But something else happened in year 4 that Warren did not learn about until later. Jonas Rudd, who had told Warren the plan was backwards, who had questioned the logic, who had said trees take years and winter comes every year, Jonas left 2 empty water barrels near the slough before dawn, one morning in late August. They were positioned exactly where Warren collected water for the seedlings. They were not labeled. They were not explained. They simply appeared, and they saved Warren 4 trips to the river for haul water that month. Jonas said nothing about the barrels. Warren said nothing about the barrels. But the barrels were there, and that was the first crack in the community's wall. Year 5. The wedge became visible from the road. The tallest box elders along the inner arms stood 9 feet. The willows were taller but scrubby, their trunks bending with the wind, their canopy filling the gaps between the heavier species. The cedars and spruce were the real measure, shoulder high, uneven, some thick with branches touching, some thin where drought or insects had thinned them. But they were present. From the road, a man on horseback could see a dark wedge shape on the open prairie, its point aimed northwest, its arms spreading toward a cabin that looked smaller than it should because the trees were growing around it. Bowyer came back. He dismounted this time, a difference Warren noted, and walked the rows. He counted trunks. He measured spacing with his stride. He pressed his thumb against cedar bark, and it did not crumble. "You have lost fewer than I expected," Bowyer said. It was not praise, it was an adjustment in his calculations. But shoulder-high cedar does not stop a gale. A hard wind is not the same as a hard blow. Warren asked what the difference was. Bowyer looked northwest. "The difference is about 30 miles an hour and 15 degrees. You have not seen the difference yet. When you do, you will know whether your wedge is a shelter or a decoration." He rode east again. Warren stood at the wedge point and looked down both arms. The trees were growing. The question was whether they were growing fast enough, tall enough, dense enough to face the thing Bowyer was talking about, a true killing wind, a northwest gale that froze cattle standing and buried cabins in drift and killed men who stepped 10 feet from their doors to fetch wood and could not find their way back. 5 years of work, 5 winters endured without the wedge's protection, 5 seasons of planting, watering, weeding, replacing, and defending trees that were still not tall enough to do what Warren had drawn on the cabin wall in stove charcoal on a night when his children were sleeping and his wife was 3 months in the ground. The wedge was growing, but so was winter. By late autumn of 1886, the wedge was no longer a joke that men repeated at the store. From the settlement road, it looked like a dark arrowhead driven into the prairie grass, its point aimed into the prevailing wind, its arms curving southeast around the Voss cabin, like the hull of a ship built from living wood. The tallest inner box elders stood 14 feet. The cedars and spruce were uneven, some 10 feet, some only 7 where drought years had stunted them, but they had thickened. Along the windward face, branches touched, needles interlocked. Where gaps had opened from dead seedlings, Warren had filled them every spring with new stock, because he knew that a gap in a windbreak was worse than no windbreak at all. A gap funneled wind. It accelerated the airflow through the break, like water through a narrowed channel, and could throw a jet of cold air directly at whatever sat behind it. Warren began taking crude measurements that autumn. He hung 2 strips of flour sack, cut from the same bolt, the same weight and weave, from 2 posts. One post stood at the windward face of the wedge point, fully exposed. The other stood beside the cabin door, inside the protected pocket at the wide end of the arms. During a good blow out of the northwest, 30 miles an hour or better, enough to flatten the grass and push birch sideways at the tie, the outer strip snapped flat and rigid, the fabric cracking like a whip. The inner strip lifted and fell. It moved, but it did not whip, it did not crack. It rose and settled the way cloth moves in a room with an open window, not in a room with no walls. Bowyer saw the strips during his autumn inspection. He watched them for 2 full minutes without speaking. Then he said, "A flour sack is not a family." Warren said he knew that. "A 30-mile blow is not a killing blow," Bowyer said. "What you have shown me is that your trees interfere with the wind. I could have told you that from the road. What I cannot tell you is whether they will hold when the wind is 50 and the temperature is 20 below and the snow is driving horizontal. That is not a test you arrange. That is a test that arrives." Barbro came for her autumn visit. She had made the walk every spring and fall for 5 years now, sleeping in the cabin, working the rows, eating at the table with Ruth and Abel, as though she had always been part of the household. She examined the flour sack test and said nothing encouraging. Instead, she walked to the end of the north arm and stood where the last row of cedar met open prairie. "Here," she said, "this is where it will fail." She was right. The north arm ended abruptly. The last row of trees gave way to open grass, and the wind coming down the arm's outer face would curl around the end and drive back into the protected zone. It was the same problem a short fence created. The wind did not stop at the edge. It bent around it, and the turbulence at the bend could be worse than the open wind itself. Warren had known this. He had felt it on windy days, standing at the north arm's end and sensing the air swirl back toward the cabin. But he had not had enough seedlings or enough time to fix it. Barbro told him to fix it now. He spent 2 weeks in October extending both arms. He did not have enough live seedlings for full rows, so he used what he had. Cut cedar tops from the thickest trees, laid as brush walls between stakes, plus a staggered row of young willows that would not be tall enough this winter but would fill the line within 2 years. The extensions added 40 feet to each arm. It was not elegant. It was branches and stakes and prayer, but it closed the ends enough that the curl might not reach the cabin. Blaine, meanwhile, spread a new rumor through the settlement. The Wedge would pile snow until the roof caved. It was a clever attack because it sounded plausible. Trees caught snow. Everyone knew trees caught snow. A wall of evergreen pressing against a cabin would trap every flake the wind carried and bury the house in a white tomb. Blaine told this to anyone who would listen, and enough people listened that Jonas Rudd came by one evening to ask whether it was true. Warren showed him the distance. The nearest dense row was over 70 feet from the cabin, far enough that the snow dropping out of the slowed air would hit the ground between the trees and the house, not against the walls. The cabin sat in the wind shadow, not in the snow shadow. Jonas looked at the gap and nodded once, the way a man nods when he has checked the math and found it right, and then he went home without saying anything else. But the rumor was planted, and Blaine did not need it to be true. He needed it to be believed long enough for Warren to seem dangerous, reckless, a man whose experiment might bury his neighbor's children. The first snow came on the 3rd of November. The second came on the 9th. By the 20th, the ground was frozen hard, and the slough was iced over, and the grass had disappeared under a white cover that stretched unbroken to every horizon. The trees stood dark against it, green and black in a white world, the wedge shape visible for a mile. The point aimed northwest like the prow of a ship waiting for the sea to arrive. The sea arrived on the 4th of December, 1886. The barometer at Blaine's store dropped 1.5 inches between dawn and noon. Old men in town said that was the fastest fall they had seen in a decade. The clouds came from the northwest in a line so clean it looked drawn, gray-white above, blue below, and the blue was not sky. It was the shadow of air so cold and so fast that it colored the light ahead of it. By 2 in the afternoon, the temperature had fallen from 18 degrees above zero to 4 below, and it was still dropping. The wind came first as gusts, sharp percussive hits that rattled the cabin door and made the stovepipe hum. Then the gusts stopped being gusts and became a constant force, a wall of air moving southeast at a speed that made the chimney smoke flatten before it cleared the roofline. The smoke did not rise. It was pushed down and south, scraping the sod roof, disappearing into the white blur that had replaced the sky. This was the storm that plain settlers called a northwest gale. The narrator can name it. A fast-moving winter low that had formed over Alberta and raced southeast across Saskatchewan and Montana, gathering cold air and surface wind as it crossed the open prairie. It brought light, dry snow, not the heavy wet snow of a spring storm, but fine crystals that moved more like sand than water, driving horizontal, filling every gap, every crack, every unsealed seam in any structure foolish enough to stand in its path. Ruth was the first problem. She had been coughing for 3 days, a dry, shallow cough that Warren had treated with willow bark tea and an extra quilt. By the time the barometer began its drop, the cough had deepened, and by noon her forehead was hot enough that Warren's hand flinched when he touched it. Fever, in a cabin that needed to stay warm, during a storm that was about to test every cord of wood he had stacked. He had 4.5 cords. Bowyer's math said a family in a tight cabin burned a cord every 2 weeks in deep winter. But this was not a tight cabin, and this was not ordinary cold, and Warren knew the calculation could shift in hours. Abel, 11 years old now and tall enough to reach the woodpile without a step, made the first fuel run at 3 in the afternoon. He opened the door, and the wind hit him in the chest. He leaned into it and crossed the 12 feet to the woodpile and filled his arms and came back. The trip took 2 minutes. When he shut the door, his eyebrows were white with frost and his cheeks were bright red. The second fuel run came at 4:30. The temperature was 9 below and falling. The wind had not stopped. It had increased. Warren could hear it doing something he had never heard before, a low, constant moan that came from the northwest, not in gusts, but in a single sustained note, as though the entire prairie had been turned into a reed and the sky was blowing across it. He asked Abel to check the flour sack strips. Abel opened the door 6 inches and looked toward the wedge point. He could not see the outer post. The snow erased everything past 40 feet. But the cabin door strip was visible, and it was moving the way it moved during a regular blow, lifting and falling, not cracking, not flat. Warren could not be sure what the outer strip was doing, but he could hear the trees. Through the cabin walls, through the wind, he could hear the cedars. They were roaring, not creaking the way individual trees creak in a storm, roaring, the way a solid mass roars when a force hits it all at once, thousands of needles and hundreds of branches vibrating in a sustained chord. The wedge was taking the full weight of the gale. At 5:15, Ruth's fever spiked. She was on the pallet by the stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned, and her body was shaking so hard the pallet frame rattled. Warren fed the stove 2 splits of oak. He had traded labor for half a cord of oak in October, hard wood that burned slow and hot, and banked the coals tight. The cabin temperature was the only thing between Ruth and the kind of chest fever that had killed Eliza. He could not let it drop. The stove drew steadily. This was the first thing Warren noticed, the first concrete proof that the wedge was doing something beyond theory. In a normal northwest blow, the stove coughed. The draft reversed when gusts hit the chimney at the wrong angle, pushing smoke back into the cabin. Tonight, with a gale howling beyond the trees, the stove drew clean. The chimney draft was steady. The air inside the wedge's shadow was not calm. It moved, it gusted, it was cold, but it was not the same air that was screaming across the open prairie. It had been slowed, broken, negotiated with. At 6:45, Abel saw something through the side window, a light, a lantern swinging in the snow, moving south along the ridge where Jonas Rudd's quarter section bordered Warren's. The light bobbed twice, disappeared, reappeared lower, and then went out. "Someone is walking," Abel said. Warren told him to stay with Ruth. He opened the door and stepped into the wedge's pocket. The cold was savage, well below zero now, the wind chill far worse. But he could stand upright. He could breathe without the air being torn from his mouth. He could see the nearest cedar row, 20 feet away, the branches bowed and shuddering but holding, snow streaming along the arms of the wedge in 2 white rivers that diverged from the point and rushed down both sides, leaving the pocket behind them in a strange, fractured stillness. Beyond the cedars, the world was gone. White noise, white air, white ground indistinguishable from white sky. Warren heard shouting, faint, torn by the wind, but human. He pulled on Eliza's old wool coat. He still wore it 5 years later, because it was the warmest thing he owned, and pushed toward the north arm. If you are invested in this story, stay with us and subscribe, because the trees are about to face the one test Warren could never rehearse. He found Ephraim Bowyer on his knees in the snow, 50 yards beyond the north arm, trying to crawl southeast. Bowyer was 66 years old, and he had left his horse at Jonas's place and attempted to walk to the Voss cabin because Jonas's stovepipe cap had blown off, and the cabin was filling with smoke and cold air simultaneously. And Jonas's wife Clara was inside with their youngest child, and could not hold the blanket over the pipe hole and tend the fire at the same time. Warren hauled Bowyer upright. The old man's face was gray-white on the left side where the wind had been hitting it, and his fingers were stiff inside his gloves. Warren got him inside the wedge line, and Bowyer stopped fighting. He stood in the pocket behind the cedars, and his body changed. His shoulders dropped, his breathing slowed, His eyes opened wider. The wind was still present. The cold was still brutal. But the killing force of it, the thing that had knocked him to his knees on open ground, was gone. My God, Bowyer said. He was not a man who used those words casually. Warren left him at the cabin with Abel and Ruth and went back out. He followed the north arm to its end, where the brush extensions rattled and shook but held, and then he crossed into open prairie, and the gale hit him full in the face, and he understood immediately why Bowyer had been crawling. The wind was a physical object. It pushed him backward. It drove snow into his eyes, his nose, his mouth. He covered his face with his arm and leaned into it at a 45-degree angle and walked the 200 yards to Jonas's cabin by dead reckoning and luck, and the fact that he had walked this path 1,000 times and knew the ground by feel. Jonas's cabin was chaos. The stovepipe cap had been ripped off by a gust, and the pipe was now an open chimney, sucking heat out and letting wind in. Clara Rudd was standing on a chair holding a doubled horse blanket over the pipe hole, but the wind tore at it and her arms were shaking, and Jonas was trying to nail a board across the opening from outside and could not hold the nails steady because his hands were numb. Warren climbed onto the roof in the wind. He had canvas in his coat. He always carried a folded square of sailcloth, a habit from his father's loft, and he wrapped it over the pipe hole and lashed it down with a cord, run through 2 nail heads Jonas had already set. The canvas bellied and snapped, but it held. The draft reversed. The stove began drawing again. Smoke filled the cabin for 30 seconds and then cleared. Clara was half conscious by the time Warren got inside. She had been standing on that chair for over an hour, holding the blanket, and her arms had given out twice. Her youngest, a boy of 3, was wrapped in every quilt in the cabin and was crying steadily, the kind of crying that meant cold, not pain. "Come with me," Warren said. Jonas looked at him. "My cabin is warm. The stove is drawing. Bring the boy and come." They crossed the 200 yards in the open, and it nearly finished them. Jonas carried the child inside his coat. Clara walked between the 2 men, one on each side, leaning into Warren, then into Jonas, then stumbling, then being pulled upright. The snow drove into them so hard that Warren felt it hitting the backs of his eyes when he squinted. Then they reached the north arm of the Wedge, and Bowyer's reaction repeated itself. Clara stopped. Jonas stopped. The wind dropped, not to nothing, not to calm, but from a screaming, pushing, freezing force to a rough, gusting, survivable cold. The snow stopped driving horizontal and began falling at an angle, then almost straight. The cedars roared on the windward side. On the leeward side, the sound was a low hiss, like sand on canvas. Jonas looked at the trees. He looked at the cabin. He looked at Warren. "I hear it," he said. "The difference. I hear it." They got Clara and the boy inside. Warren fed the stove. Ruth's fever had not broken, but it had not climbed. Bowyer sat against the wall with his hands wrapped in a flour sack and his color slowly returning. Abel heated water for Clara. 7 people in a 12-by-16 cabin, and the cabin was warm, not comfortable, not spacious, but warm, because the stove was drawing clean, and the wind outside was spitting its fury on a wedge of cedar and spruce and box elder that a man had planted 5 years ago because his father had taught him what canvas could do to air. Warren stepped outside one more time at midnight. The gale had not weakened. If anything, it had intensified. The trees at the wedge point were bending visibly, their trunks flexing, their root plates pressing against the frozen ground. Snow had piled along the outer windward face in a drift 4 feet deep, and the 2 arms of the wedge wore ribbons of white like streamers on a mast. But the cabin pocket was clear. The snow that made it past the trees fell in a soft fan between the last row and the house, accumulating in a low, even layer instead of the hard-packed drift that buried walls and sealed doors. He checked the flour sack strips one last time. The outer post was buried. The strip was somewhere under the drift at the wedge point, lost. The inner strip hung from the cabin door post, lifting and falling in the reduced wind, white with frost, stiff with cold, but moving freely. It had never gone flat. All night, through the worst gale the territory had seen in years, the strip had never snapped rigid. Warren went back inside and added 1 armload of wood to the stove. He calculated. He had been feeding the fire since 3 that afternoon, 10 hours. In that time, he had burned 3 armloads. In a normal gale, in the old cabin before the Wedge, he would have burned 10. The difference was not survival versus comfort. The difference was that his 4.5 cords of fuel, which should have lasted 3 weeks in a normal winter, would now last through January and into February. The Wedge did not stop winter. It did not make the prairie warm. It did not silence the wind or melt the snow or cure Ruth's fever. What it did was simpler and more important than any of those things. It bought time. It slowed the rate at which the cold extracted heat from the cabin, which slowed the rate at which the stove consumed fuel, which slowed the rate at which Warren's resources depleted, which meant he could wait. He could wait for the storm to pass, for the fever to break, for morning to arrive. The Wedge gave him hours, and on the frontier, hours were the difference between the living and the dead. Ruth's fever broke at 4 in the morning. She opened her eyes and asked for water, and Warren gave it to her and sat beside her and listened to the cedar trees roar on the other side of the wall, holding the line. Morning came gray and still. The gale had passed southeast in the night, leaving the prairie under a hard white crust and a sky the color of old tin. Warren opened the cabin door at first light and stood in the pocket behind the Wedge and looked at what the storm had done. The north wall of the cabin had a feathering of frost along the chinking, thin, delicate ice crystals that had formed where moisture in the air met the cold surface of the logs. But the wall was intact. The chinking held. There was no packed drift against the door, no snow sealed against the foundation, no white weight pressing the sod roof toward a collapse. The snow inside the Wedge pocket had fallen in an even layer, 4 inches deep, soft enough that Warren's boot sank to the sole and no farther. He walked to the wedge point. The outer windward face was a different world. A drift 4 feet deep ran along the base of the cedars, sculpted hard by the gale into a ridge with a sharp crest. The trees had caught the snow the way a net catches fish, not all of it, but enough that the force behind it was spent before it reached the cabin. The drift sat where it belonged, against the trees, between the rows, in the space Warren had left for exactly this purpose. 70 feet of open ground separated the last row from the cabin. The ground in that gap held a dusting of snow and nothing more. He walked both arms. The north arm's brush extension had lost several stakes, and the cut cedar tops had scattered, but the living trees behind them were standing. The south arm was intact. At the wide end of the Wedge, where the arms opened behind the cabin, the wind had deposited a low, soft fan of snow that would melt into the planting basins when the temperature rose. It was, Warren realized, not just protection, it was irrigation. Jonas Rudd's cabin sat 300 yards east on open ground. Warren could see it from the wedge point, and what he saw confirmed everything. A hard-packed drift ran along Jonas's north and west walls, 3 feet high in places, driven so tight by the wind that it would need a shovel and an hour to clear. The woodpile Jonas kept his wood in an open stack on the northwest side, which was the wrong side, which everyone kept their wood on because the northwest side was closest to the door, was buried. Scattered splits poked out of the white like broken fingers. Jonas would spend the morning digging out before he could feed his stove. Blaine's storehouse in town fared worse. Warren heard about it from a freighter 2 days later. A shutter on the north face had torn loose during the gale, and the wind had driven snow and ice into the storage room. 3 flour sacks were ruined. 2 barrels of kerosene had been knocked from their shelf by the shutter banging open, and one had cracked, leaking fuel across the floor. And behind the storehouse, in the open lot where Blaine kept his dairy cow, the animal was dead. Frozen standing, the freighter said, though Warren suspected that was an exaggeration that would grow with each retelling. What was not an exaggeration was the loss. Blaine's storehouse had no windbreak, no shelter, nothing between its walls and the gale had punished the omission. Bowyer returned 6 days after the storm. He came on foot this time, which meant he had ridden to within walking distance and then continued alone, and Warren understood that what was about to happen was not an inspection. It was something else. Bowyer walked the wedge from point to pocket without speaking. He knelt at the point and studied the drift lines, the way the snow had split at the sharp end of the wedge and streamed down both arms, leaving 2 clear, diverging tracks like the wake behind a ship's bow. He measured the drift depth at the windward face with his arm, sinking it to the elbow. He walked the gap between the last tree row and the cabin and kicked at the thin snow cover and found dry, unfrozen grass beneath it. Then he came back to where Warren stood and looked at him with an expression Warren had never seen on Ephraim Bowyer's face. It was not admiration. It was recalculation. It was the expression of a man who had carried a number in his head for 40 years and just discovered the number was wrong. "I told you trees would not save a bad house," Bowyer said. "I was right about the house. Your chinking is still poor, and your stoveplate is still cracked, and your roof will sag again by March." He paused. "I was wrong about the trees." Warren said nothing. "I have inspected 300 tree claims in this territory," Bowyer said. "Most of them are rows, straight rows on flat ground, planted because the law says plant trees with no thought given to what the trees are supposed to do besides satisfy the acreage requirement. I have never seen a man plant trees to change the wind." He looked at the wedge point. "Draw me the plan. I want to show it to other claimants." It was not an apology. Bowyer was not a man who apologized. It was something more useful. It was authority shifting. The county tree claim inspector, the man who had told Warren to sell the claim and take his children somewhere with a roof that holds, was now asking Warren to teach him. Warren drew the plan on a board with stove charcoal, the same way he had drawn it on the cabin wall 6 years earlier. He marked the point, the arms, the row spacing, the species by position, the gap between the last row and the structure. He noted the distance, 70 feet minimum from the densest row to the cabin, enough for snow to fall without packing against the walls. He noted the arm length. Each arm had to exceed the height of the tallest trees by enough that the wind could not curl around the ends without losing its force. He noted the evergreens, cedar and spruce on the windward face, because bare deciduous branches in January were holes, not walls. Bowyer took the board and said he would carry it to the next 3 claims he inspected. He did not promise it would work for everyone. He said the wind was different on every quarter section, and a man had to read his own ground. But the principle, split the wind, do not fight it, was sound, and he had seen it hold against a gale that had killed livestock and buried cabins across the county. Jonas came next. He did not knock. He walked into the wedge pocket on a Tuesday afternoon and stood between the cedar rows and turned in a slow circle, looking up at the branches, looking at the snow pattern on the ground, looking at the cabin door that had stayed shut all night during a gale that had ripped his own stovepipe cap into the dark. I want you to show me where to plant, Jonas said. Warren could have reminded him, could have repeated Jonas's own words. You came here for land, now you are planting a wall across it. And let the silence do the work. He did not. He walked Jonas to the northwest corner of Jonas's quarter section and pointed at the grass. Watch the grass, Warren said. Where does it bend first when the wind comes? Jonas watched. The afternoon breeze was light, but it came from the northwest as it always did, and the grass on Jonas's open ground bent in a wave that started at the far corner and swept southeast across the field. Warren told him to walk the line where the grass bent hardest and mark it with stakes. That is your wind line, Warren said. Your point goes there. Your arms spread toward the cabin. The trees do not stop the wind. They tire it. Jonas asked about species. Warren told him cedar on the outside, box elder or willow on the inside, and never leave a gap because a gap was an invitation. Jonas asked about distance from the cabin. Warren told him 70 feet at minimum, close enough to benefit, far enough to avoid the snow pile. Jonas asked how long it would take. 5 years before you notice it, Warren said. 7 before you trust it. 10 before you forget what the wind used to feel like. Jonas nodded once, the way Jonas nodded, like a man closing a ledger, and went home. He planted his first row that spring. He used cottonwood instead of cedar because cottonwood was free along the slough, and Warren told him cottonwood would not hold in winter because its bare branches were useless against cold wind, and Jonas planted it anyway because Jonas did what Jonas did. By the second winter, Jonas understood. He replaced the front row with spruce seedlings Warren gave him from the nursery trench. 3 other neighbors came within the month. A man named Pollard, not the same Pollard who had sold Warren the claim, but a cousin who had filed nearby, asked about the angle of the arms. A widow named Nell Caro, who lived alone with a teenage son on a half-section east of the settlement road, asked about the minimum number of rows. Warren told her 2 rows minimum on the windward face, 3 if she could manage it, and he walked her property and marked the wind line with ash stakes, and showed her where the snow would drift so she could keep it away from her door. Nell asked why he was not charging. Warren said the wind was free. The knowledge of how to manage it should be the same. It was not charity, and it was not virtue. It was Barbro's influence. The woman who had walked 40 miles on foot to see whether a man planting trees in a strange shape was a fool or something else, and who had taught him puddling, basins, and weed rings without asking for anything except that the work be done right. Warren had received the knowledge through respect, and he passed it on the same way. Blaine's reaction arrived not as confrontation but as maneuver. He could not deny the storm damage. His own storehouse was proof, so he changed tactics. He sent word through the settlement that Warren's Wedge violated claim improvement expectations because it removed nearly 2 acres from agricultural use. Under the Homestead Act, improvements meant cultivation. Trees were not cultivation. A man who planted trees instead of wheat was not improving his claim. He was decorating it. It was a legal threat, not a physical one, but it carried weight. If the county assessor agreed, Warren could lose the homestead claim, the land itself, not just the crop income. Blaine did not need the threat to succeed. He needed it to create uncertainty, to make other settlers hesitate before copying the plan, to keep Warren's influence from spreading further than Blaine's credit network could reach. Warren heard about the threat from Bowyer, who told him plainly that the tree claim and the homestead claim were separate filings, and that trees planted under a timber culture claim were exactly the improvement the law required. The Wedge satisfied both the letter and the spirit of the act. Blaine's argument had no legal footing. It had social footing. Enough settlers believed the storekeeper's version that Warren spent 2 weeks answering questions instead of planting. But Bowyer shut it down by filing his inspection report with a note that the Voss claim represented the most purposeful tree claim improvement I have assessed in this district. Blaine read the report. He said nothing publicly. But the debt note was still in his ledger, and Warren still owed $11 against it, and Blaine was not a man who forgot numbers. Barbro came back that spring for what Warren did not know would be the last time. She arrived in April, later than usual, walking slower, carrying the same canvas sack and spade, but leaning on the spade now instead of strapping it across her back. She was 63, and the winters had worked on her the way they worked on everyone, settling into the joints, thinning the blood, pulling at the architecture of a body that had spent 30 years fighting weather on open ground. She examined the wedge with her usual rigor. She counted trunks, checked the replacements Warren had planted in the fall, pressed her thumb against bark. The cedars were dense now, 10 to 12 feet, branches interlocked, the windward face a green wall that blocked sight lines from the point to the cabin. The spruce were shorter but thickening. The box elders had recovered from the grasshopper damage and stood over 14 feet, their canopy filling the gaps above the evergreen line. "The shape is good," Barbro said. "Now make it feed you." She had brought grafted plum cuttings and chokecherry seedlings from a surviving Norwegian homestead garden in the valley. She planted them along the leeward side of the south arm, inside the wedge's protection, where the reduced wind and the trapped moisture from snowmelt created a pocket warmer and wetter than the open prairie. Plum trees needed shelter. Chokecherry needed moisture. The wedge provided both. It was Barbro's final teaching, and it was the most important one. The wedge was not just a wall. It was a microclimate. The protected space behind the trees was not identical to the exposed prairie. It was warmer in winter, cooler in summer, wetter in spring, and calmer in every season. Anything planted inside that space had an advantage that nothing on open ground could match. The wedge did not just protect the cabin, it protected everything Warren chose to grow behind it. They worked together for a week, Barbro planting, Warren digging, Ruth carrying water, Abel hauling mulch. The plum cuttings went into prepared basins with clay-puddled roots. The chokecherry seedlings lined the inner arm in a low hedge that would produce fruit in 2 years if the roots held. Barbro showed Ruth how to prune the plum shoots to encourage branching, and Ruth listened with the concentration of a girl who had spent 6 years watching adults build things that mattered. On the last evening, Barbro and Warren disagreed. It was not dramatic. It was a difference in philosophy that had been building quietly across 6 years of shared work. Warren wanted to extend the wedge into a full enclosure, closing the open southeast end with a hedgerow to create a complete sheltered yard. Barbro said no. "Leave it open," she said. "The wind needs somewhere to go after the trees slow it. If you close the back, the air pools and stagnates and the snow has no path out. You will trap what you meant to shed." Warren argued. He had felt the southeast gusts that sometimes curled back into the pocket, and he wanted to block them. Barbro held firm. The wedge worked because it was open at the back. The air entered slow and left slow, and the leaving was as important as the arriving. Close the exit, and the design failed. Warren deferred. He trusted her more than he trusted his own instinct on this, and he was right to trust her, though he would not fully understand why until 2 years later when a neighbor who closed his sheltered yard found the stagnant air trapping moisture against his cabin walls and rotting the chinking from the inside. Barbro left the next morning. She walked the slope road east with her spade across her back. She had straightened up for the departure, pride or habit or both, and Warren watched her until she was a mark on the grass. He did not know he was watching her for the last time. She died in June, in her own cabin in the valley, after a day of planting cottonwood cuttings along a neighbor's fence line. She had worked through the afternoon, come inside, sat in her chair, and not stood up again. A neighbor found her the next day. She had been alone, which was how she had lived for the last 7 years, and which was how she would have chosen it if choosing had been offered. Warren heard the news from a freighter a week later. He stood at the wedge point and looked down both arms, the trees she had helped him plant, the basins she had taught him to dig, the mulch rings she had demonstrated on her first visit 7 years ago when she had pulled a dead seedling from the ground and told him he had not buried it yet. He found her knife 2 days later. She had left it stuck in the mulch beside a cedar seedling at the base of the north arm, the last tree she had checked before leaving. The blade was short and worn, the handle wrapped in leather cord gone dark with years of sweat and clay. Warren cleaned it and put it in his coat pocket where he kept the square of sailcloth, and he carried both for the rest of his life. What Barbro left was not a technique, it was a way of seeing. She had looked at the prairie and seen not emptiness, but possibility. Not a place where trees could not grow, but a place where trees had not been asked to grow in the right way. She had looked at Warren and seen not a sailmaker's son out of his depth, but a man who understood force and direction and was applying it to a new material. She had taught him by doing, corrected him by showing, and argued with him only when the design required it. Her last words to him on that final visit had been quiet and specific. Do not plant only what you need. Plant what the next person will need. Warren did not fully understand the instruction until he was standing at her knife and realizing that every seedling she had ever planted on his claim had been for someone she would never meet. The prairie fire came in April of 1888, 2 years after the storm and 1 season after Barbro's death. It started 12 miles west, where a dry spring and a careless campfire met an east wind that had been waiting for a reason. The fire moved through cured grass at a speed that made running pointless. A man on horseback could outrun it, but a man on foot could not, and the cattle and pigs and children who could not get to shelter were in danger within minutes of the first smoke sighting. Warren smelled it before he saw it. The air changed, flat, acrid, tasting of ash, and then the western sky went orange at the base and brown above, and the smoke column leaned east like a falling tree. He had no time for the plan he would have wanted. He had minutes. The fire was not aimed at the wedge. It was running east along a wide front, but the dry grass around the outer arms was fuel, and if the flames reached the cedar rows, the resin in the evergreen needles would ignite, and the wedge would burn from the outside in. Warren thought of Barbro, not of her words, though her words came too. He thought of the way she made decisions. Fast, specific, grounded in what was in front of her, not in what she wished was in front of her. He sent Abel to the slough with every bucket. He sent Ruth to soak burlap sacks in the water trough. He took the plow and birch and cut a fire line, a strip of turned sod 30 feet wide along the outer windward face of the wedge, running from the north arm's end to the south arm's end, ripping the grass out by the roots so the fire would hit bare dirt and have nothing to eat. The plow cut was not deep enough. The grass was thick, and the roots were matted, and birch was pulling hard, but the sod was 18 inches of tangled fiber that did not want to break. Warren got 3/4 of the line cut before the fire reached the outer perimeter. The flames hit the uncut section first, a 40-foot stretch along the south arm where the grass had not been turned. The fire climbed the dry stalks and reached the mulch ring around the outermost cedars, and the mulch caught. Warren was there with wet burlap, beating the flames at the base of the trees, and Abel was there with a bucket, throwing water on the branches, and the heat was extraordinary. a wall of radiant force that made the skin on Warren's forearms tighten and pull. They lost the two outer rows on the south arm. The cedars burned, not explosively, not in the crowning fire that destroys a forest, but in a slow hissing ignition that climbed the resin-soaked bark and consumed the needles from bottom to top, leaving black skeletons standing in a line of smoke. 14 trees in all. 6 years of growth gone in 20 minutes. Abel's hands were burned. Not badly. The burlap had protected his palms, but the backs of his hands, where the wet cloth did not reach, were red and blistered from the radiant heat. He had not dropped the bucket. He had not stopped throwing water. He was 13 years old, and he had stood in front of a fire and fought for trees his father had planted when Abel was too young to carry a pail. But the inner rows held, the dense green interior of the Wedge, the spruce and cedar that had been growing for 7 years, watered and mulched and weeded and tended through drought and grasshoppers and wind, did not burn. The fire reached the turned sod line and stopped. The flames ate the outer mulch, took the 2 exposed rows, scorched the bark of the 3rd row, and went no farther. The green wood would not carry the fire. The moisture in the living needles resisted the heat. The density that Warren had built to stop wind also stopped flame, not perfectly, not without cost, but enough. The settlement fire burned 6 miles of grass, 3 haystacks, a sod barn, and a section of Jonas Rudd's fence line before it hit the Cheyenne bottoms and ran out of fuel in the wet ground along the river. No people died. 2 milk cows died. The damage was significant but not catastrophic, and the reason it was not catastrophic was that the fire moved fast enough that it burned the surface and left the roots. The grass would come back. The haystacks would not. Warren stood in the burned strip along the south arm and looked at the 14 dead cedars. Each one had taken 6 years to grow to the height where it mattered. Each one would need to be replaced, and the replacement would take another 6 years to reach the same height. The Wedge had a wound now, a gap in the outer armor, a place where the wind could reach deeper than the design intended. He thought of Barbro's instruction about gaps. A gap in a windbreak was an invitation. The wind would find it and accelerate through it and throw a concentrated jet of cold air at whatever sat behind it. 14 dead trees was not a disaster. It was a deadline. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. He replanted the south arm that autumn. He used larger stock, 3-year cedar transplants that he dug from the nursery trench he had started behind the cabin 2 years earlier, following Barbro's instruction to grow replacements before they were needed. The transplants were already knee-high when they went into the burned positions, which meant they were 3 years closer to useful height than bare-root seedlings would have been. Barbro had told him to plant what the next person would need. She had not said the next person might be himself. Abel helped with bandaged hands. Ruth helped with water. Jonas came on the 2nd day without being asked and dug 6 holes before Warren noticed he was there. Nell Caro sent her son with a bundle of spruce seedlings she had grown from seed Warren had given her the year before. The trees that went back into the burned strip came from 4 different homesteads, and none of them were paid for because the knowledge had been given freely, and the community had decided without discussion that the replacement would be the same. Blaine saw the fire damage differently. He saw opportunity. Within a month of the fire, he began advertising what he called Voss pattern protection lots. Quarter sections sold with a planting plan included, drawn from the charcoal diagram Warren had made for Bowyer. Blaine had copied the diagram from the board that Bowyer carried on inspections, traced it onto paper, and added his store name at the bottom. He sold 4 lots in 6 weeks at a premium of $3 above the normal claim price, and he planted nothing. The buyers planted. They used Blaine's copy diagram and planted rows where the diagram showed rows and used whatever species Blaine had in stock, which was mostly cottonwood because cottonwood was cheap and Blaine did not carry cedar. Warren heard about the lots from Nell Caro, who had seen the advertisement posted at the grain elevator. He did not care about the credit. He cared about the design. Blaine's copies were wrong. The arm angles were approximations. The row spacing was too tight, and the species were deciduous, which meant the windward face would be bare branches in January. Worse, 2 of the 4 buyers had planted their rows too close to the cabin, within 30 feet of the foundation, which meant the snow caught by the trees would pack directly against the walls. Warren went to Bowyer. Bowyer went to Blaine. The conversation was brief. Bowyer told Blaine he would not certify any tree claim planting that did not meet spacing and species standards, and Blaine's copied plans did not meet them. The arm length was too short. The row distance was dangerous. The cottonwood would fail in winter. Blaine told Bowyer that settlers had the right to plant what they chose. Bowyer told Blaine that the county inspector had the authority to reject a tree claim filing that showed negligent planting and that selling a plan under Warren's name without Warren's involvement met his definition of negligent. Blaine went quiet. He did not withdraw the advertisement. He did not offer refunds. He simply stopped promoting the lots and let the 4 buyers discover the problems themselves when the first hard wind of the following winter drove snow against their cabin walls, and the bare cottonwood branches did nothing to stop it. Warren visited each of the 4 buyers in the spring. He corrected the arm angles. He added evergreen rows to the windward face. He adjusted the cabin distance. He did not mention Blaine. He did not need to. The buyers mentioned Blaine themselves, and the phrase Voss pattern stopped appearing in Blaine's advertisements and started appearing in conversations where Blaine was not present, attached to Warren's name instead of the store's. The Wedge was no longer Warren's alone. It was becoming a practice, imperfect, locally adapted, argued over in detail, but accepted in principle. The wind was the same on every quarter section. The trees were available to anyone willing to plant them. The knowledge of how to arrange them was spreading the way seeds spread, carried by work and proximity, and the stubborn evidence of one cabin that had stayed warm during a gale that had frozen everything around it. By the autumn of 1889, Warren's claim had become something the settlement had no word for. It was not a farm in the way the county assessor used the term. It produced wheat on fewer acres than any neighboring quarter section, and the yield per acre was modest because the Wedge and the nursery trench and the leeward orchard consumed ground that could have carried grain. It was not a tree claim in the way the Timber Culture Act intended. The trees were not planted in regulation rows on 40 acres, but in a deliberate shape on fewer than 3, arranged not for acreage compliance, but for the single purpose of changing what the wind did to the structures behind them. What it was, increasingly, was a destination. Settlers came to look. They came on horseback and on foot, and once in a lumber wagon that had no business on the Slough Road, its axle cracking on a frozen rut 200 yards from the gate. They came because they had heard about the storm, the gale of '86 that had frozen Blaine's cow and buried Jonas's woodpile and driven Bowyer to his knees on open ground, and they had heard that one cabin had stayed warm through the worst night because the man who lived in it had planted trees in the shape of a ship's bow. Warren did not enjoy the attention. He was not built for it. He was a man who worked with his hands and spoke in specifics, and felt most comfortable when the conversation was about root depth or row spacing, or the particular behavior of northwest wind when it hit a dense evergreen barrier at an oblique angle. But the people came, and they had questions, and the questions were practical, and Warren answered them the way Barbaro had answered his, by showing, not telling. A typical teaching day by the early 90s looked like this. Warren would meet a settler at the Wedge Point and walk the windward face, explaining nothing until the visitor had stood on both sides of the tree line and felt the difference. The wind did the teaching. On the exposed side, a man's coat pressed against his back and his hat brim bent flat. On the sheltered side, 20 feet away, the coat hung loose and the brim held its shape. Warren let the silence after that comparison do the work. Then he walked the visitor to the cabin and showed them the nursery trench, a 40-foot row of cedar and spruce seedlings grown from cones collected in the wedge itself, ready for transplanting. "Take what you need," he would say. "Come back in spring if they die." He charged nothing. Barbro had charged nothing. The knowledge moved the way water moves through good soil, downward, outward, following the path of least resistance, pooling where it was needed most. The settlement began to change in ways that were visible from the road. Jonas Rudd's second-year spruce row, planted on Warren's advice with transplants from the nursery trench, was already chest-high by 1890. Nell Caro's windbreak was an L-shape, so she lacked the acreage for a full wedge, so Warren had designed a two-arm shelter that blocked the northwest and the north, leaving the west open because her terrain had a natural rise that deflected the worst of the westerly gusts. The Pollard cousin had planted a straight row, which Warren had told him was less effective than a wedge but better than nothing, and the straight row was proving him right on both counts. It slowed the wind but did not split it, and the snow piled against the cabin side instead of falling in the gap. Warren taught each settler differently because each quarter section was different. The wind did not behave the same on flat ground as it did on a slope. A cabin near a slough had different moisture than a cabin on a ridge. A homestead with existing cottonwood along the fence line could incorporate those trees into the design. A homestead on bare prairie had to start from bare ground. The principle was universal: split the wind, slow it, give the structure behind the trees a chance to hold its heat. But the application was local every time. He taught Abel. This mattered more than the neighbors, though Warren did not say so. Abel was 15 in 1890, tall, quiet, steady-handed from years of carrying water and hauling mulch and planting seedlings in clay-puddled basins. Warren taught him how to read wind the way his own father had taught him to read wind, not from instruments or theory, but from observation. The bend of chimney smoke, the direction of snow scour around fence posts, the angle at which dried grass lays flat after a blow, the sound the trees made when the wind shifted, a change in pitch, a different register in the roar that told you the gale had backed from northwest to north, and the south arm was now taking more pressure than the north. Abel learned the way Ruth had learned, which was by watching, and then doing, and then correcting himself before Warren could correct him. The boy had Eliza's patience and Warren's stubbornness, and he would spend an hour adjusting the angle of a transplant hole before setting the seedling because he understood that the angle determined the root direction, and the root direction determined whether the tree leaned into the wind or away from it, and a tree that leaned away was a tree that would uproot in a gale. Warren also taught Ruth, though Ruth's teaching went in a different direction. She had become, at 16, the settlement's informal school teacher. Not by appointment, but by the fact that she could read and write and cipher, and no one else within 6 miles had the patience to teach children who would rather be fishing. Ruth taught reading from the Bible and arithmetic from the seed catalog and geography from the rough map Warren had drawn of the county's wind patterns. She had her pupils draw wind arrows on their slates before planting Arbor Day seedlings in the schoolyard, and the children who understood the arrows planted their seedlings on the northwest side of the building, where the trees would grow into a shelter, and the children who did not understand planted them in a decorative line along the road, where they looked pleasant and did nothing. Ruth said the arrows were more important than the trees. Warren said the trees were more important than the arrows. They argued about this at the supper table, and neither won, and both were right. Blaine's reckoning came not through confrontation, but through weather. It was January of 1891, and Blaine had finally planted his own windbreak. Not a wedge, not an L shape, not any design Warren had drawn or Bowyer had certified. A single straight row of cottonwood and scrub willow, 40 feet long, set behind the storehouse on the north side. He had planted it in the fall, after 2 years of watching his competitors adopt the practice, and his customers ask for seedlings he did not stock. The row was too short. 40 feet of trees sheltering a building 60 feet wide meant 20 feet of exposed wall on each end. The species were deciduous, bare in winter, which was the only season that mattered, and the placement was wrong. 15 feet from the storehouse wall, close enough that the snow caught by the branches would pile directly against the loading door. Warren had seen the row from the road and said nothing. He had learned from Barbro that a man who corrects without being asked creates an enemy, not a student. Blaine had not asked. The January gale was not as severe as the storm of '86. It did not need to be. A 35-mile-an-hour blow from the northwest hit Blaine's short row and did exactly what physics said it would do. The wind curled around both ends of the 40-foot line and drove inward, creating turbulence behind the trees that was worse than the open wind would have been. The snow, instead of being deflected, was funneled through the gap between the ends and the building and packed against the loading door in a drift 3 feet deep. The bare cottonwood branches, leafless in January, did nothing to filter the snow or slow the wind above shoulder height. The storehouse's north shutter, which Blaine had repaired after the '86 storm, tore loose again, not from the direct gale, but from the swirling turbulence his own trees had created. Blaine lost flour sacks. He lost 2 barrels of kerosene, again, from the same shelf, knocked by the same shutter. The loading door was sealed by drift and took 3 men with shovels half a day to clear. The settlement heard about it the way the settlement heard about everything. In the store itself, from men buying supplies while Blaine stood behind the counter with a face that looked like he had swallowed something that would not go down. Bowyer came by the storehouse on his inspection circuit. He examined the row, measured the distance to the building, noted the species, and wrote in his book. Then he stood at the counter and waited for Blaine to speak. Blaine did not apologize. He did not admit error. He did not congratulate Warren or acknowledge that the design he had copied and sold incorrectly was the design he should have followed himself. He stood behind his counter with his hands flat on the wood and said 5 words. Then mark it right. It was not a warm conversion. It was not the satisfying admission that a story demands and life rarely provides. It was surrender, the specific, grinding surrender of a man who had spent 6 years dismissing a practice that had proved itself against every test the prairie could offer, and who had finally run out of ways to be right. Blaine did not become Warren's ally. He became Warren's customer. He paid Warren $3 zarpaz, the first money Warren had ever accepted for the knowledge to walk the storehouse perimeter and mark the correct wind line, arm angles, and species for a proper shelter belt. Warren took the money because Blaine would not have respected a free service, and he spent it on cedar seedlings for Nell Caro's second row. Bowyer certified the plan. Blaine planted it that spring using cedar and spruce on the windward face and box elder behind, with arms long enough to exceed the tree height by the ratio Warren specified. The storehouse survived the next winter without losing a shutter. Blaine said nothing about it. The absence of complaint was, from Blaine, the highest praise available. In front of Bowyer and half the settlement, on a supply day in March, Blaine sold a sack of flour to Warren at the standard price and did not mention the debt. Warren noticed. Blaine noticed that Warren noticed. The $11 on the ledger stayed on the ledger, but Blaine stopped referencing it And by the following year, the page had been turned and the number had become the kind of figure that exists in a book no one opens. Nell Caro came into Warren's life the way the trees came into the prairie, slowly, through work, without announcement. She had been widowed 3 years when Warren first marked her windline. Her husband had died of a burst appendix on the freight road to Fargo, leaving her with a half-section, a teenage son named Pater, and the choice between selling to a speculator and staying to work ground she had never plowed alone. She stayed. She plowed. She planted the L-shaped windbreak Warren designed, and when the first cedars rooted and held through winter, she came back to the Voss cabin with questions about the leeward orchard. The questions became visits. The visits became work days. Nell would arrive with Pater on a Saturday morning and spend the day in the nursery trench, transplanting seedlings, sharpening spades on the whetstone Warren kept under the porch, sorting seed by species and age. She was methodical in a way that Warren recognized, the same way Barbaro had been methodical, the same way Eliza had been methodical, the way people are who understand that careful work is the only kind that survives weather. Their courtship was measured in shared labor. Warren showed Nell how to graft plum shoots onto hardy rootstock, and their hands were close together on the branch while he demonstrated the cut. Nell showed Warren how to set a proper sod wall for a root cellar. She had learned from a Ukrainian neighbor in her first year, and they argued about the angle of the drainage ditch until they realized they were both wrong and the water should go east, not south. Ruth set her school books beside the seed catalogs on the table and did not comment when Nell began staying for supper. Abel split extra wood without being asked. They married in the spring of 1892, 2 years after Barbaro's death. The ceremony was at the cabin, performed by a circuit preacher who arrived on a mule and left before the meal because he had 3 more homesteads to visit before dark. Nell brought her milk cow and her plow, and Pater, who was 17 and strong enough to handle the heavy braking work Warren's back could no longer sustain. Warren's back had been declining since the year of the fire, the hours of bending over planting trenches, the frostbite he had suffered in his feet during the Jonas rescue, the accumulated toll of 12 years of labor done by one man in a place that required 3. The frostbite had left him with a permanent limp. His left foot, which had gone numb during the crossing to Jonas's cabin in the '86 gale and had not fully recovered despite the doctor's treatment in the spring after, gave him a rolling walk that the settlement recognized at a distance. Warren Voss could be identified on the road by his gait before his face was visible, and the limp was both a cost and a credential, proof that the man who built the Wedge had paid for the knowledge in his own body. Nell brought order to the household that Ruth had managed since the age of 9. She brought warmth to the cabin that had been efficient but austere, the warmth of a woman who hung curtains and planted marigolds along the leeward porch and laughed at supper in a way that made Abel look up from his plate with an expression Warren had not seen on his son's face since Eliza died. The cabin was still 12 by 16, still chinked with prairie mud, still heated by a stove with a patched firebox plate. But it was, for the first time since 1880, a home in the way that word means when it includes someone who chose to be there. Years compressed. Warren and Nell had a daughter in 1893, a girl named Sigri, after Barbaro's mother, though Warren did not tell Nell this until years later, and Nell said she had known because Warren only spoke one woman's name with that particular weight. Petter took over the heavy plowing, and Abel took over the nursery rows, and Ruth married a school teacher from the river town and moved 20 miles south, but came back every Arbor Day to help her pupils plant seedlings in the schoolyard with the wind arrows drawn on their slates. By the mid-90s, the Voss claim had a protected yard with the Wedge at full maturity, cedars over 20 feet, spruce nearly as tall, the box elders towering above them all at 25 feet with canopies that shaded the inner rows in summer and stood bare but irrelevant in winter because the evergreen wall behind them did the real work. The leeward orchard produced plums and chokecherries. The nursery trench supplied seedlings to any settler who asked. A rough map, drawn on canvas in stove charcoal and copied 17 times, showed the wedge design with annotations for different wind directions, terrain types, and building positions. The copies had traveled as far as the James River settlements to the west and the Red River Valley to the east. The name Voss Wedge spread informally, carried by Bowyer's inspection reports and by the settlers who had planted their own versions and found that they worked. Warren did not claim to have invented the shelter belt. Settlers had been planting trees around their homesteads since the first sod houses went up on the plains. What Warren had done was specific. He had applied a sailmaker's understanding of wind to the arrangement of trees, shaped the planting to split the prevailing gale rather than simply block it, and taught the design to anyone who asked. The wedge was not new in principle. It was new in shape, in intention, and in the precision of its wind reading. Barbro deserved the credit she could not collect: her puddling, her basins, her weed rings, her insistence on evergreen density, her grafted plum cuttings. These were the techniques that kept the trees alive long enough for the shape to matter. Warren said so to anyone who listened. He kept her knife in his coat pocket and her spade in the nursery trench, and when settlers asked where he had learned the planting methods, he said a Norwegian woman had walked 40 miles to show him, and he did not elaborate because the elaboration belonged to Barbro, and she was no longer here to give it. The last scene that mattered happened in the winter of 1910, when Warren was 63 and nearly blind. Cataracts had taken most of his left eye and were working on the right, and the world had become a place of shapes and sounds, and the particular quality of light that tells a man whether the sky is clear or clouded without showing him the clouds. He sat in the cabin, the same cabin, expanded now with a lean-to kitchen Nell had insisted on, and a sleeping loft Abel had built for the grandchildren, and listened to the wind. A northwest blow had come in overnight. Not a gale, not a killer, but a steady 30-mile push that made the trees talk. Warren knew every voice in the wedge by now. The cedars at the point had a deep, sustained moan. The spruce along the north arm had a higher pitch, almost a whistle, because their needles were finer and their branches were set closer together. The box elders behind them were bare in January and made a rattling skeletal sound that added percussion to the choir. Abel came in from the morning check. He was 36, married, living in a cabin he had built on the south end of the claim with his own wedge planted around it, a smaller version, tighter, adapted to his specific wind line, designed with techniques Barbro had taught and Warren had refined, and Abel had learned by watching both. Warren asked whether the point row was holding. Abel said, "It is bending." Warren sat in his chair and listened to the trees bend, and he said, "Then it is working." A sail does not fight the wind, it negotiates. A tree does not stop the gale. It bends, gives, lets the force pass through and around and over, and stands back up when the force moves on. Warren's father had taught him this in a sail loft in Maine, holding canvas near a candle, showing a boy how the flame bent when the cloth was placed at the correct angle. The boy had carried the lesson across a continent and planted it in the ground and waited a decade for the ground to prove what the candle had shown. By Warren's later years, at least 17 neighboring farmsteads had some version of the wedge, L-shape, or shelter row he had helped mark. Most were adapted, shorter arms, different species, adjusted for terrain and wind direction and the particular stubbornness of the man who planted them. None were identical to the original. All worked to some degree. The most vivid detail was this: children walking to the settlement school on winter mornings knew which yards would give them a calm pocket to breathe in during a northwest blow. They mapped the safe spots the way children map shortcuts and swimming holes, and they passed the knowledge to the next year's children without knowing they were passing it. Warren lived out his life on the original claim with Nell and Seagree and the grandchildren who moved through the tree rows he had once defended alone. The limp from the '86 rescue never improved. His hands, scarred from a decade of digging in frozen ground and handling rough-barked cedar, curled inward as he aged, and he held his coffee cup with both palms the way a man holds something precious. He died in the spring of 1912 after asking to be carried outside to the porch, where he could hear the spruce. Nell sat beside him. The trees made their sound, the low, steady hiss of wind moving through needles that had been growing for over 30 years. And Warren listened to it the way a man listens to a language he has spoken all his life. Mercer Blaine had said it in a store full of men who laughed because the storekeeper sounded right. "You cannot eat pine needles." He was correct. Warren never ate a pine needle. The needles never became bread. They never became money or medicine, or any of the things that a practical man on an open prairie could hold in his hands and call useful. What they became was quieter than that. They became still air around a stove on a night when the temperature dropped past 20 below. They became a door that opened during a gale without the wind tearing it from its hinges. They became a place where a girl with a fever could keep breathing because the cabin held its heat long enough for the fever to break. They became the sound a man listened to at the end of his life because it was the sound of something he had built that was still standing after he could no longer stand himself. Snow fell that spring afternoon the way it always fell on the Voss claim. It came from the northwest, driving hard across the open prairie, and when it reached the dark point of the Wedge, it divided. Half streamed down the north arm, half streamed down the south, and behind the trees, in the hush where the cabin had stood for 33 years, the snow fell gently, almost straight, the way it falls when something has taken the violence out of the air and left only the quiet.